My two kids, Sam and Robbie, are twins. They're 6 years old now. A year ago, we were living in our old house, but something happened that forced us to move. It's a long, awful story. I lived in that house for 4 years. My wife, Carol, and I got married while we lived there, and we raised our kids there too. The neighborhood had slowly been getting worse, but we still planned on staying for the foreseeable future until all of this happened. We lived on a corner house. Behind us, on the intersecting road, was another house hidden behind tall trees and thick bushes, so we barely ever saw those neighbors. Our neighbor on the right, however, was a man named Steve. He had moved in less than a year before everything began. I'd only spoken to Steve a few times. He had a heavy accent, was hard to understand, and didn't seem very friendly. Two of his upstairs windows overlooked our backyard. There wasn't much privacy, but I never saw lights on in those rooms, so I assumed they were unused. One summer afternoon, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard with their blow-up pool and water guns while I did yard work. As I walked toward the detached garage, I noticed Steve standing at one of his upstairs windows. The moment he realized I saw him, he turned and walked away. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Later that evening, as the sun was setting, the kids went back outside to play in the pool, while Carol and I were in the kitchen making dinner. Suddenly, their laughter stopped. Robbie ran inside and told me there was a flashing light coming from the neighbor's window. I followed him outside. He pointed to one of Steve's upstairs windows overlooking our yard and said a white light kept flashing. I immediately asked the twins if it looked like a camera flash. They both said yes. I told them to dry off and come inside immediately. When I told Carol, she assumed the worst and urged me to confront Steve. I went next door and knocked. His car was in the driveway, but he never answered. That only made things worse. Weeks later, one night, Carol and I heard our side gate quietly open and close. I went outside and searched the yard with all the lights on. Nothing. But Steve's backyard lights were on. I walked over to the fence and nearly jumped when Steve suddenly appeared on the other side and asked if I needed something. I asked if he'd seen anyone sneaking through our yard. He said no. I then bluntly asked if he'd been watching my kids, explaining that they thought someone had been photographing them. He exploded, yelling, acting overly offended. Without proof, I apologized and went back inside. Carol was furious. Then came the night that broke us. Carol woke me in a panic after hearing the kids screaming. Robbie said someone had been outside his window and that there had been a camera flash. I looked out our bedroom window and saw Steve peeking out from one of his upstairs windows, the same one overlooking our backyard. I stormed over and rang his doorbell repeatedly. He never answered. I called the police and made a report. We moved out within a month. When my wife and I moved into our apartment, nothing about the place felt unusual. It was an older building with thin walls and long hallways, but the rent was reasonable and the neighborhood was quiet. Most of the tenants were students or young couples, and everyone mostly kept to themselves. We were just happy to have our own space after years of roommates. The first thing I set up after unpacking was the internet. I named the Wi-Fi something generic, set a password I wouldn't forget, and didn't think much about it afterward. We both worked long hours, so most nights were quiet. We'd come home, eat dinner, watch something mindless, and go to bed. For the first few months, everything worked perfectly. The problems started slowly. Videos began buffering more often. Pages took longer to load. Online meetings for work would freeze for a few seconds at a time. It was annoying, but I blamed the internet provider. I'd reset the router, wait a few minutes, and things would go back to normal for a while. One night, after resetting it for the third time that week, I decided to log into the router settings to see if anything looked off. I'd never done that before, but I figured it couldn't hurt to check. That was when I noticed an unfamiliar device connected to our network. The name didn't tell me much. It wasn't a phone or a laptop model I recognized. It was just a long string of letters and numbers. I assumed it might be one of our devices labeled incorrectly, but after checking everything we owned, nothing matched. To be safe, I changed the Wi-Fi password. The next evening, the internet slowed down again. I checked the router. The unknown device was connected. I told myself it had to be a glitch. Still, I changed the password again, this time making it longer and more complicated. I also turned off any guest access settings I could find. That should have solved it. It didn't. Every time I checked, that same device would reappear. What bothered me more was the timing. According to the connection history, it almost always connected late at night, usually between midnight and 4 in the morning. During those hours, our internet usage would spike, even though we were asleep. Around the same time, my wife started mentioning things that made her uneasy. She said she sometimes felt like someone was standing outside our apartment door late at night. Not knocking, not walking, just there. She said she could feel it. I brushed it off at first. I told her apartment buildings make weird noises and that it was probably someone passing through the hallway. Then one night, while we were sitting on the couch, the small indicator light on our webcam turned on by itself. We weren't using it. I stared at it for a few seconds, hoping it would turn off on its own. It didn't. I unplugged it and put it in a drawer. My wife didn't say anything, but I could tell she was unsettled. After that, I started noticing sounds outside our door late at night. Sometimes it sounded like someone shifting their weight. Other times it was just silence that felt heavier than it should have. I checked the peephole more than once and never saw anyone. Once or twice, I opened the door suddenly, hoping to catch whoever it was. The hallway was always empty. No matter what I did, the unknown device kept appearing on the network. I started sleeping lightly, waking up whenever the building made noise. My wife began locking the bedroom door before bed, something she'd never done before. I downloaded a Wi-Fi analyzer app on my phone. It showed nearby networks and signal strength. One night, when I saw the unknown device connected again, I walked around our apartment to see if I could pinpoint where the signal was strongest. It wasn't coming from inside our unit. The signal grew stronger near the stairwell. I followed it down to the basement. The basement was mostly storage rooms and maintenance areas. The lighting was dim and uneven, and the air smelled damp. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and old electrical panels lined the walls. It wasn't a place people spent time unless they had to. The signal led me to a storage area at the far end. That's where I saw him. He was sitting on a folding chair, positioned as if he'd been there for hours. A laptop rested on his knees. Several cables ran from his equipment into small holes drilled into the wall, disappearing into the building's infrastructure. He looked relaxed, almost comfortable. He noticed me right away. He smiled. "I was wondering when you'd notice," he said casually. I didn't respond. My throat felt tight, and my mind was racing. I took in the details I hadn't noticed at first. The drill marks in the concrete, the extension cords, the router sitting beside him, identical to the one we had upstairs. He didn't stand up. He didn't threaten me. He just watched my reaction like he was studying it. I turned around and walked back upstairs without saying a word. That night, neither of us slept. The next morning, I told my wife everything. She wanted to call the police, but I hesitated. I couldn't explain exactly what he'd done wrong in a way that felt concrete. He hadn't touched us. He hadn't broken into our apartment. At least, not that we knew. Still, we reported it to the building manager. They said the basement storage areas were supposed to be locked and that no one should have been down there. They promised to look into it. When I checked the router that night, the unknown device was gone. For a few days, things seemed normal again. The internet worked. The hallway was quiet. The webcam stayed unplugged. We tried to convince ourselves it was over. Then the device came back. This time, I didn't go looking for him. We started packing instead. We found a new place across town and broke our lease early. It cost us more than we could comfortably afford, but neither of us argued about it. On our last night in the apartment, I checked the router one final time. The unknown device was connected. As we carried the last box to the car, I glanced down the hallway. Someone was standing at the far end, watching us. I didn't get a good look at his face. I didn't need to. We never went back. I didn't believe in bad feelings before all this happened. I believed in logic, explanations, coincidences. That's why I ignored the warning signs for as long as I did. My wife, Carol, and I lived in that house for 4 years. It was where we got married, where we brought our twins home from the hospital. Sam and Robbie were identical, 6 years old when everything happened, and inseparable. They did everything together. The neighborhood wasn't great, but it wasn't dangerous either. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. A few break-ins down the street, some shouting at night, nothing that felt personal. Our house sat on a corner lot. To the left was an empty stretch of road. Behind us was another house mostly hidden by thick trees and overgrown bushes. We rarely saw anyone there. On our right lived a man named Steve. Steve moved in about a year before we left. I didn't know much about him. He was quiet, middle-aged, thick accent I couldn't place. Our interactions were limited to polite nods and a few awkward conversations over the fence. He never smiled, never asked about the kids. What bothered me most was his house. Two of his upstairs windows looked directly into our backyard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Curtains were usually drawn. Lights were almost never on up there. I assumed those rooms weren't used. That assumption turned out to be wrong. It was a hot afternoon in early summer when I first noticed him. Sam and Robbie were outside, playing with a blow-up pool and water guns. Carol was inside folding laundry, and I was trimming hedges near the garage. I glanced up toward Steve's house and saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. A man standing there. Steve. He wasn't leaning. He wasn't walking past. He was standing still, watching the yard. The second our eyes met, he stepped back and disappeared from view. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for him to come back. He didn't. That night, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just looking outside. Maybe I startled him. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Whenever the kids were outside, I'd occasionally notice one of those upstairs curtains shift. A light flick on briefly. A shadow pass by the window. Never long enough to be obvious. Always long enough to notice. The moment that changed everything happened one evening just before sunset. The twins were outside again, laughing, splashing water everywhere. Carol and I were in the kitchen making dinner when the noise stopped abruptly. No laughter, no shouting, nothing. A few seconds later, Robbie ran inside, dripping wet and pale. "Daddy," he said, "there's a light." I followed him outside. He pointed to Steve's upstairs window. A bright white light flashed on, then off, then on again. I asked both boys the same question without thinking. Did it look like a camera flash? They answered at the same time. Yes. I didn't hesitate. I told them to get dressed and go inside immediately. Carol knew something was wrong the second she saw my face. When I told her, she went quiet, then angry. She wanted me to confront Steve right then. I walked next door and knocked. His car was in the driveway. Porch light on. No answer. I knocked again. Harder. Nothing. That night, Carol cried. I stayed awake, listening for sounds that never came. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The lights stopped. The windows stayed dark. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then came a gate. We had a side gate leading into the backyard. It creaked loudly when opened. Always had. One night, well after midnight, Carol shook me awake. "I heard the gate," she whispered. I listened. Nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. Every light in the yard was on. The gate was closed. The fence was intact. But Steve's backyard lights were on. I walked toward the fence and was about to call out when someone spoke from the darkness. "Can I help you?" Steve stepped into view on the other side of the fence. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I asked if he'd seen anyone go through our yard. He said no. I hesitated, then asked him directly if he'd been watching our kids, if he'd taken photos. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He shouted, accused me of being sick, threatened to call the police. His voice carried through the quiet street. I backed down, apologized, went inside. Carol was furious. She wanted to move right then. I told her we had no proof. That was my mistake. The night everything ended, it was storming. Thunder, heavy rain, the kind of night where every sound feels closer. I woke up to screaming. Not distant, not muffled. Right outside the kids' room. Robbie was crying. Sam was shaking so hard I could feel it through the mattress when I picked him up. Robbie kept repeating the same thing. He was there. He took a picture. I ran to the window and pulled the curtain back. Across the yard, in Steve's upstairs window, was a light. And behind the glass, Steve's face, watching. I didn't think. I didn't grab a phone. I ran. I pounded on his door until my hands hurt. Rang the doorbell over and over. No answer. I called the police. When they arrived, the upstairs lights were off. Steve didn't answer the door for them either. The officers took a report, asked questions, said they'd keep an eye on things. That night, Carol slept in the kids' room with them. I stayed awake on the couch. A week later, I found something taped to the inside of the fence. A printed photo. Grainy. Black and white. It was our backyard. The twins were visible in the frame. So was the upstairs window. We moved out within a month. Steve's house stayed occupied, but our old house didn't. Every family that moved in after us left within a year. One lasted only 6 weeks. Sometimes I still think about those windows, and I'm grateful we noticed before he decided to stop watching.